Thank you very much, Julia, for this lovely introduction and those very nice personal words. Thank you, Helena, for your presentation. I was really following with great attention. And many thanks to the organizers who are putting together this summer academy. And I remember we had some great conversations last year when you were preparing, and it's really great to see and to listen to all the speakers these couple of days. So thanks a lot for allowing us to come together in that way. Yes, okay, so spaces of possibility and potentiality. Conviviality, we heard about conviviality, convivialism, complexity quite a lot so far. Conviviality is about living together with difference. Living together with difference, not through fantasies of consensus, but through working out the complexities of cooperation and opposition. Then convivialism. Okay, where is my mouse? Okay, convivialism. Convivialism is this recent movement we heard about yesterday, thanks to Frank Adloff. This recent movement carried by several hundred intellectuals, nowadays even internationally across the world, including Edgar Morin, and which aims to foster a politics of interdependence. And it counts among its multiple inspirations Morin's understanding of generalized complexity. We already heard so far, thanks to the previous speakers, about complexity, about convivialism. What I will want to add myself to this conversation today is the argument that convivialism needs more queering. And it needs it beyond a mere lip service that is paid to gender and queer diversity, for example, in the two convivialist manifestos. This is especially important if we want to keep alive the engagement of conviviality with difference, rather than let it fall back into some comforting routines or certainties. So I will start with Morin's complexity, continuing the discussion that Helena started in the previous presentation. So Morin and complexity, and then I will shortly introduce the process of queering. And together then they point to re-identification in place of identities. I will then sketch out two kinds of safe spaces that are required for people to engage in a queer conviviality. And these are spaces in social practices, which I call, on the one hand, spaces of possibility, and on the other hand, spaces of potentiality. So first of all, complexity. Edgar Morin's generalized complexity is the complexity of the living, whose ongoing emergence and creativity defies the limit of any single logic. The dominant culture is marked by a fear of that generalized, or as some people call it, qualitative complexity. That fear produces clear and logical ethics and norms, which are a denial of the complexity. The fear of complexity can also lead to a dialectical illusion, an illusion whereby the resolution of multifaceted, intricate dilemmas would bring about some progress and would solve or dissolve qualitative complexity. Qualitatively complex dilemmas cannot be systematically resolved, neither through Manichaean ethics with either or logic, nor through sublating dialectics in the dialectical tradition. They require instead a capacity to work with sustained contradictions without a compulsion to resolve them and to impose clarity. This is about gaining sagacity, and sagacity is a form of wisdom that is integrated, including the whole knowing body-mind, making sense in all senses of the word, sensitive, sensorial, and sensible. This is also about mediating between several realities without flattening them through, for example, dialectics. Morin, in his method, the 6 volumes of the method, quite a long work actually. Anyway, Morin in his method suggests instead what he calls in French a dialogique. And this dialogique aims for something quite different from dialectics. It's also something different from the earlier dialogic of Mikhail Bakhtin. But I won't go into further details about that, which is a very abstract and highly complex issue in itself, and one could talk about it for a long time. The reason why I mention it at all is that this is one way to approach a messy and generative complexity, which is this complexity that Morin tells us about, which is something that he also calls chaosmotic. We already saw the term just before in the previous presentation, and which is something which is turning away from classical dialectics and actually has something in common with this notion of queering, which I want to talk about today. Morin's complexity can help us to balance also interdependence and difference without reifying identities. For this, we need to pay attention to how Morin overcomes both reductionism and holism. What I say will be slightly different from what Helena said just before. Morin's complexity is not simply holistic. Morin suggests that in any complex system, and I'm quoting him here, the whole is more than and less than the sum of the parts. Reaching an understanding of generalized or qualitative complexity means going beyond 2 binarily opposed simplifications. On the one hand, the simplification of reductionism, which invites us to a learning process where we take apart the whole and study its parts, of the classical science, but also the simplification of holism, which invites us to perceive the qualities that emerge from the whole beyond adding up the mere qualities of its parts. Often, the criticism of reductionism only tells us that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, omitting that it is also less than the parts, and thereby perpetuating what can become an imaginary of harmonious wholes, from harmonious human communities to a harmonious nature. And this is inviting us to seek out bright futures in harmonious identities and collectives. And this is something I want to question to some extent. Instead, Morin's insight that the whole is more and less than the sum of its parts has a queer significance because it opens up, in principle, our attention to harmonies and disharmonies everywhere we look. It also points to disharmony in and through harmony. And it points to harmony in and through disharmony. Here you see also the connection with a full rich meaning of Heraclitus, the heritage of Heraclitus that Helena talked about earlier. The specifically queering insight coming from this attention is that it teaches us the following. Whatever communities or societies, whatever historical period we are in, affirming any shared collective identity is at once both emancipatory and repressive. A specific collective allows the emergence of certain qualities. However, this very same collective also both represses some of the qualities of its members, individuals, of course, but also subgroups, subcultures, etc. And it also suppresses some of the possibilities for the emergence of other collective identities. So I'm coming now to this notion of queering. So what do I mean by queering? The verbal form queering is often understood as a transversal and transgressive process of questioning of norms, starting with gender and sexual norms, and eventually also questioning other kinds of norms. Queering brings to visibility a wider diversity of already emerging practices. It deepens the significance of their divergences, and it encourages a diversification of alternative visions. The queer is both a critique and a dream at the edge of the given. Queering affects a given context in space and in time. It affects the existent dominant norms. It creates what one could call a disturbance or disturbances in a normative field. The queering process disrupts the tendency to want to figure things out by drawing categories and rules, mastering them and controlling them. Queer troubles any teleology that would have us manipulate situations to make them fit into norms and reach prefixed normative goals. Queering upholds the subjects in their multiplicity and, very important, in their indeterminacy, while challenging the processes of normalization and homogenization in social practices and in subjectivities. Queering is an art of resistance and resilience to hegemonic forces. It can develop, in the words of the artist and sex educator Kathin Jesse from Vancouver, so I'm quoting her, it can develop, opening quote, radical disharmony with various sides of oppression, gender, morality, the patriarchal nuclear family, the prevailing culture of nature, and white racial supremacy. End of quote. So that was Kathin Jesse. Coming now to the re-identification. For suppressed possibilities to get a chance to shape up, the grip of a certain collective, the hold of a certain identity must be allowed to loosen. And this must be allowed to happen again and again. A queering process is a process of disidentification, questioning hegemonic identities, denormalization, questioning dominant norms, and denaturalization, questioning natural or supposed natural evidences, always at a certain point in time and in a certain cultural context. This process will become something different again and again as the context changes. Queering processes may then enter in a generative, recursive dialogue with processes of re-identification, of re-normalization, and of re-naturalization, as long as those latter processes do not set themselves goals of excessive stability or rigid lines of development. Such queering processes should be set in motion again and again in order to keep the engagement with living with difference, which we heard, this notion of conviviality is about, living with difference, to keep this engagement alive as an active principle and not merely a hollowed out routine of conviviality. In terms of social practice, queering as the questioning of norms allows its partakers to open up the possibility to gain a deeper understanding of how oneself, as well as others, may not fit into certain norms. It is a learned ability to become otherwise. It's a term I'm taking from its formulation by Wendelin Cooper, so the two words other and wise with a minus in between, otherwise. That possibility opens for anyone reaching some safe spaces for the unfolding of queering processes and also willing to engage in such processes. This can happen thanks to the existence of or creation of safe spaces. Safe spaces for queering as mental spaces, spaces in the minds, as social spaces interconnecting us both in presence and digitally, and as physical spaces, geographic spaces. These safe spaces need to be open-ended. They need to be open to indeterminacy. So I'm coming to say spaces of possibility and of potentiality. I suggest to distinguish those safe spaces into two forms: spaces of possibility and spaces of potentiality. Please think of the two expressions: having possibilities and having potential. Possibility implies some empowerment, some leverage, whereas potentiality exists even in disempowered and marginalized situations. Possibility is about an option that begs space to unfold, working towards potential futures. A queer possibility is a queer experience that asks to be acted with. Potentiality is about the invocation of an option that emerges out of a horizon of existence. Concrete examples for the first one, for spaces of possibility, can be found in, for example, in my documentary film, Han Other, about the city of Hanover and cultural and sustainability initiatives in that city, which is available for free on YouTube. If time allows, I might have a time to, at the end of this presentation, to mention a few illustrations from there. Spaces of possibility facilitate challenging experiences, imagination, and experimentation that open up future-oriented questions and perspectives in situations of uncertainty. They allow their users to experience things like surprise, puzzlement, and confusion while learning something. They are spaces where queering futures may happen through on-the-ground, imaginative, experimental, and creative processes. They are spaces of what some people, like for example, Michael Citrin, called prefigurative practice. This means spaces where people are active today, rehearsing for possible futures, even if the necessary conditions are still not met today. Spaces of potentiality. They indicate a different, a more ephemeral, a more subtle safe space where ephemeral performances allow the dawning of unidentified or even amorphous experience. They are spaces where potential futures emerge on the horizon. In the words of queer theorist José Esteban Muñoz, I'm quoting him now, unlike a possibility, a thing that simply might happen, a potentiality is a certain mode of non-being that is imminent, a thing that is present but not actually existing in the present tense. End of quote, and that was Muñoz. Both spaces facilitate a belonging across difference and with difference, but in different ways. Spaces of possibility network pre-existing groups and communities transversally into cooperative archipelagos in specific localities and on online social platforms. A space of possibility connects the we, W-E, we, of existing collectives into new configurations, forging cooperation across difference at the intersection of various shared affinities. Spaces of potentiality sketch the silhouettes of potential collectives in emergent lines of encounters at temporary sites, forming trans-local gatherings, both online and offline. A space of potentiality does not focus on connecting existing collectives. Instead, a we, again, W-E, we, a we emerges in response to what the identities of collectives have obfuscated. This we invites a disturbance in single or combined fields of oppression, such as race, nation, gender, sexuality, class, religion, ability, and species. A space of potentiality then, in the words again of José Muñoz, speaks, I'm quoting again, speaks to a we that is not yet conscious, the future society that is being invoked and addressed at the same moment, end of quote. However, while the Convivialist Manifesto, I'm going back to the Convivialist Manifesto, while this manifesto and its formulations do allow for spaces of possibility, they do not offer much spaces for spaces of potentiality. Most especially, the manifesto sees, when it discusses common sociality, the principle of common sociality, it sees common sociality as only possible for, and now I'm quoting the second manifesto, opening quote, those whose desire to be here together is greater than the desire to be elsewhere and with others, end of quote. A queered we is bound to be further repressed as long as such a principle is held up and enforced. Coming to conviviality queered, there's a few keywords there which I discussed today and some other keywords in gray which I did not discuss but would, time allowing, would also be relevant for the discourse. Conviviality queered. So conviviality as an art of living together on this planet would benefit from a queering process that unsettles certainties of good life while exposing relative privileges. How good will any specific good life be for whom? How to seek possibilities that open up otherwise good lives for whom else? One of the benefits of the queering process is that it incites its partakers not to gloss over the messiest aspect of the so-called intersectional problems. This means staying with the contradictory complexities. Instead of running to fix problems, instead of running for appealing solutions, or what Bateson talked a lot about, the shortcuts, running for the shortcuts. Queering not only steps into the mess, actually queering also ventures into darker zones of shaming. And this means also venturing into darker zones of shaming also for the self, rather than merely shaming others, which one finds, for example, in the Convivialist Manifesto, shaming the powerful elites. Queering questions and learns by attentively mapping regions covered in darkness by dominant cultures in which we are all partaking. And this is again something that Kathleen Jesse is talking about in her writings. And eventually, queering turns this shame, or some aspects of shame, into pride, as we can see from the experience of racialized minorities and from the experience of LGBTQ communities in the previous decades. And all of this is wisely reclaiming spaces for future convivialities. So this was about the kind of theoretical or conceptual input. Depending on how much time I have left, I want to mention a few illustrations very shortly, which you can find more about if you look at the documentary film and other. One of them I think is quite useful for, I will just use two illustrations. One of them is I think useful for the spaces of possibility. The first one, it's a network of cultural agents, of artists and creatives on the one hand, and many different civil society activists, sustainability activists, intercultural, refugees welcome, and other initiatives, all in the city of Hanover. And this network is called Kultur des Wandels, KDW Netzwerk, which means culture of change, but also is a joke about the KDW supermarket in Berlin for those who visited Berlin.
Sacha, you have 5 minutes left.
5 minutes left, so I will try to be quick. Anyway, this is a very good example of some of the qualities I mentioned of spaces of possibility, and that they are networking of different existing collectives through a specific approach, which is a kind of, I would say a kind of punk approach, a do-it-yourself punk approach. Just to summarize it very shortly. An example of the spaces of potentiality, I don't have a direct example because this is conceptual development which I had after doing this specific empirical research in the city of Hanover. But the one example that would come the closest is another artistic initiative from the Wundersame Aktionsbündnis der Tante Trottoir, the Wondrous Action Lines of Aunt Sidewalk, which is a group of performance artists who work together with people who are willing to join their workshops and do urban interventions in the streets. And some of their interventions have those qualities of potentiality, and also some of their working processes. I don't have time, I'm describing it in some writings in detail, but some of their processes have those qualities of searching for potentiality, of looking for the indeterminate, of not, fixing things in advance more than some other initiatives. So that would be an example of the second in this specific artistic performance work. The illustration here in short, this what you see on the pictures, this is one demonstration they did in Hanover when there were a lot of demonstration of extreme right-wing people in Germany. All of a sudden, this Pegida and so on. And their demonstration was a demonstration of the confused, where they kind of demonstrated confusion and Ahnungslosigkeit, you would say in German. Which provoked the people a lot, of course, in the streets. Why would you demonstrate that you are confused? So I won't have time to go into details, but for the first kind of spaces, the spaces of possibility, which I spent already some years empirically researching, for that one, I have a number of we have with colleagues a number of research insights on some of the qualities of those spaces. I don't have the equivalent for potentiality, only for possibility. For those of you who can read in German, there is a book at Transkriptverlag, Stadt als Möglichkeitsraum, where this is discussed. I'm especially discussing it in the case of those artistic and cultural networks in my own chapters in the book. And for those who would prefer something in English, you have to wait for next year. There will be a book at Routledge. The link is down there. I mean, the title is down there, which is right now we are preparing, which will again expose or explain, present those insights from the cities in Germany that I researched, but also including colleagues from who discuss about cities in Canada, in Russia, in India, in Singapore, and in the USA. So other colleagues also from some of them from the ESA, whom Julia mentioned earlier, the European Sociological Association. Yes, I think I won't have time to go into the details of all those qualities because of the time limitation. But as you can see, indeterminacy, which we mentioned several times this afternoon, is also one of the key qualities of spaces of possibility. And actually, there is also a Singaporean architect and an urban theorist who speaks about spaces of indeterminacy, etc., etc. I mean, I'm just going to stop it there. Otherwise, I would start going into the rabbit hole of trying to explain all of those single qualities. So thanks a lot for your attention.